This took place back home on my reservation. I'm Algonquin First Nation from Canada. On the res, traditional beliefs and legends of the paranormal are still big part of our community. The paranormal is a regular part of life. We believe in a spirit world, and we believe that sometimes these beings can cross over into our world, and maybe even live amongst us. Anyways, here's the story. It was the fall of 2011. I was 16 years old and living in a city near the reservation with my mom. Every weekend we'd go back home to the res to see my dad and my little brother. One Friday, during the drive back home, I got a text from a friend of mine. There was a party that night and she wanted to know when I'd be home so she could come pick me up. I gave her a time and she told me she'd swing by. My mom and I get home, and as soon as we stepped inside the house, we see my dad and my cousin sitting at the kitchen table drinking some beers. They're both cops on the res, and beers on a Friday evening means that they had a particularly tough week at work. Typically, the toughest cases to deal with are child abuse and molestation, so a part of me feels sad upon seeing them. They both look tired and drained, but they're happy to see us. We say our greetings, catch up a little, and my dad asks me if I have any plans. I mention the party and tell him where it'll be. He and my cousin share a weird look. I don't know, should we tell her? My cousin said, looking at my dad. He laughed, and they decided that I should probably know what's been going on since I'd be going to a house pretty deep in the woods later that evening. Hey, start with the first strange call they got on Monday night. An older woman called saying that people were outside of her house knocking on all of her windows. She said she couldn't see anybody, but there must have been at least 3 people judging by all the different locations of the knocking. They arrive at the woman's home, inspect all around the house, even check the woods, but nothing comes up. They tell her that it's probably just some teenagers playing tricks on her and that there isn't much else they can do besides patrol around the area in case they come back. On Wednesday night, the same woman called again with the same problem. She said people were knocking on all her windows. It had rained that day and there was mud all around this woman's home, so they figured that at the very least, they'd find footprints, but they couldn't find a thing. This is when they started feeling like something was off, because there were huge patches of mud everywhere. They thought maybe the woman was lying, but they just told her the same thing they told her a few nights prior. By Thursday night, everyone on the res was talking. It turns out, this woman wasn't the only one experiencing the knocking. She was just the only one to call the police. People were linking it to supernatural causes, but my dad was still sure it was just a group of teens pranking people. But then they got another call from the same woman for the same reason. They rushed over and were met with the same situation, except this time, the woman's neighbor walked over looking pale as a ghost. "Is this about the knocking?" he asked, looking very shaky. "Yeah, did you see something?" The man nodded and said, "You guys are gonna think I'm crazy." He goes on to explain that he'd stepped outside for a cigarette on his front porch when he heard knocking. He looked around and saw something by the old woman's house. There was a black figure standing outside her window looking into her home. He said it looked like a person, completely made out of shadow, but he could tell it was solid. He couldn't make out any features on it. He stared at it, completely in shock, and watched the thing as it knocked a couple of times and then darted around the house knocking on every single window. He said it moved too fast to be human. It was practically a blur. It went around the house a few times, then it ran across the road into the tree line, behind one tree in particular, as though it were hiding. The man was frozen, but he couldn't look away. The black shadow then leaned out from behind the tree, staring directly at him with yellow eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and then it smiled, showing many small, pointed teeth. I almost shit my pants. He tried to joke, but his voice was still shaking. My dad didn't know what to make of this, but after checking on the old woman and finding her okay, although shaken, he told them that he'd keep an eye on things and to just put it out of their minds. Fast forward to Friday. By this point, everyone's got their own story. In addition to numerous people experiencing the knocking, there were also quite a few more sightings, and everyone described the thing exactly the same to my dad. One woman was taking her trash bin out to the road when she thought she saw someone in her peripheral vision standing near the trees. As she walked back up the driveway to her home, she felt like she was being watched. Right before she was about to open her door to go back inside her home, she looked back and saw 2 reflective yellow eyes watching her from the trees. She said they were about 5 feet off the ground. Another couple was driving at night and they saw a humanoid figure standing in the middle of the road. As they got closer, they slowed down, and it turned around to face them. They saw the figure had reflective yellow eyes and the sharp, pointed teeth as it smiled at them. They stopped the car, too afraid to get any closer to it, until they decided to just speed past it. It was a narrow road and the figure was only a few feet away as they drove by it. They said it was staring at them the whole time. "You sure you still want to go to that party?" my dad asked. But my friends were already pulling into the driveway, so I gave my family hugs and kisses and said goodbye. They told me to be careful. I wasn't too concerned though. A common belief among native people is that negative energy attracts negative energy, so an evil spirit will be drawn to people with unresolved issues or traumas. But if you're someone who is spiritual, self-aware, and basically a good person, that, in and of itself, will be protective. I get to the party and within 20 minutes, the conversation shifts towards all the paranormal experiences people have been having. I'm really curious about what everyone has to say, because they have stories that I hadn't heard yet. But my friend couldn't hold her alcohol very well. We were 16, after all, and she was crying and I was trying to make her feel better while listening to everyone's stories. One of the people at the party was related to the smoking man that my father first talked to, the one who first described the shadow thing that darted into the trees. This person told us that the experience shook the smoking man up and he had smudged his entire home. Smudging is something our people do when we're looking for extra protection against paranormal entities. The man also went to visit multiple elders around the community, asking for advice or if they knew what was going on. It's commonly on the res that paranormal experiences don't happen as often as they used to. If you talk to the elders, they have endless stories, and even more advice about how to protect yourself compared to younger generations. Anyway, the man had gone to visit some elders, and one of them had explained that the shadow thing was evidence that someone was doing an unauthorized shaking tent ceremony. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up, but it's basically, and I'm generalizing, like a Ouija board session that takes place inside a tent. People stand around the tent, while the shaman goes inside and asks questions. The tent begins to shake and you can hear the voices of spirits coming through. I've never personally been to a shaking tent ceremony because we haven't had a good enough reason to make one. Typically, our ancestors used them when they were starving in the dead of winter and needed to know where the nearest food source was. My mom's been to one, and her story is absolutely crazy. She described multiple voices, men and women, all speaking the native tongue. She said they were very upset that the people were doing a shaking tent ceremony since they weren't yet on the verge of death. The people tried to explain that we're only doing the ceremony to prove that it was real. This was at a time when our people felt like we were losing our culture as a result of residential schools. But the explanations didn't help. The spirits were angry about this, saying that the bridge between the two worlds should never be opened unless absolutely necessary because you don't know who you're communicating with. It could be good spirits, or it could be evil ones. It might be ancestors, but you never know. Anyways, back to the smoking man. The elders told him that the shadow thing with yellow eyes that everyone was hearing and seeing was a spirit. It crossed over into our world because of a shaking tent ceremony. Someone on the reserve had been doing them without the consultation of the elders, they said. At this point, two of the drunkest dudes at the party started saying disrespectful things about the shadow entity, trying to act macho. Most of us were looking at each other like, why would you disrespect an evil spirit? That's exactly how you attract it to you. That's when I went back to the sunroom to console my drunk, crying friend. But while I was with her, I noticed that the rocking chair outside on the porch was rocking back and forth by itself. I looked away immediately, refusing to make direct eye contact, but I could see it moving in my peripheral vision. We're raised in our culture to ignore paranormal experiences. Spirits feed on the energy that people put towards them, so if you freak out, get angry, yell at it, start crying, or anything like that, it will stick around once. That's what it wants. It thrives on energy of any kind. 5 minutes or so go by and I'm still seeing the rocking chair move out of the corner of my eye. Suddenly I hear a commotion. One of the other girls claims to have seen the spirit. We later nicknamed it Kokogi, an Algonquin word for monster. She said she was listening to the boys talk about the spirit, when she saw one of the boys staring very strangely out onto the balcony behind her. She turned around to see what he was looking at, and through the window was the shadow spirit sitting on the rocking chair, literally 3 feet away from her, smiling. The boy who had been staring out there sprinted towards the balcony doors, slammed them open, and charged at the spirit. I went outside to check on this boy and found him staring into the woods. He turned back to look at me and said, "Get everyone inside." The tone of his voice made me automatically obey. He came back inside and told everyone to clean up the place so that we could leave, and we spent a while just cleaning. We heard knocking coming from all around the house the entire time. Finally, we prepared to leave. People piled into their cars and began to take off. Me and the boy were walking towards his truck. He was going to drive me home, when suddenly he began to rush me and pushed me into the truck. He jumped into and peeled out of there. I asked him why he did that, but he refused to talk about it. A few days later, I ended up hanging out with him and he told me his experience of that night. While the other boys were disrespecting the spirit, he saw it appear out of thin air on the rocking chair out in the balcony. He made eye contact with it and couldn't look away. He and the spirit were staring each other down, and that's when one of the girls saw his expression. She turned around, saw the spirit, and immediately screamed. He said it was instinct to defend his friends, and that's why he ran outside and charged at it. He said that the feeling he was getting from the Kokogi was almost like he was daring him to do something. But the second he got up, the Kokogi stood up and ran into the woods, disappearing from the patio in a blur. When the boy outside, he stood on the lawn and saw it standing at the tree line, looking right at him with a smile on its face. Later, as we walked to the truck, he saw it again, and that's why he had pushed me into his truck. After he dropped us all off at our houses, he and his friend realized that they never locked the door to the cottage, so they went back. But his friend was too scared to go in, even though it was his cottage, so the boy went in by himself. The second he opened the door, he saw the thing standing inside the living room. The boy locked the door as fast as he could, and hopped back in the truck. The two peeled out of the driveway. Sightings continued for a few days after that. It was the talk of the res, but eventually everything just stopped. No more knocking, no more sightings. Everyone was curious about what happened to Spirit. What exactly was it? And would it come back? Eventually, word came down to us from up north where sightings of the same spirit were seen in a different community. White people in the town just north of us were reporting strange sightings, and other reservations near us were as well. The way the stories were coming in, it was like the spirit was traveling north. Anyways, it's 2018 now and no one else on my res has had any sighting of this particular thing.